Welcome, fellow travelers. You've just stepped into time travel to sleep, where I, Annalise, and Jasmine will gently guide you through calming stories to help your busy mind find a little rest. Whether you an insomniac, a night owl on the road, or just someone looking to drift off to a soothing tale, you're in the right place. So settle in, get comfy, and let's drift into a peaceful story together. Close your eyes and imagine the hush of a wide lagoon at night. The air smells faintly of salt and marsh, touched by the coolness of water that never entirely rests. Gentle ripples push against reeds and driftwood, carrying the echoes of wings as seabirds circle overhead. There is no sound of wheels, no clatter of hooves, no rumble of carts on stone, only water and the soft murmur of voices moving by boat. It was here among the mud flats, the shifting tides, that Venice was born, not out of wealth, not out of conquest, but out of fear. In the 5th and 6th centuries, waves of invaders swept across the Italian mainland. Goths, Lombards, and other tribes surged southward, raiding towns, burning villages, leaving family with little choice but to run. Those who could not fight fled to the margins, to the shallows of the Adriatic lagoon. At first their shelters were temporary, a scattering of huts raised on sandbars, places to wait until the danger passed. But the raids did not end, and slowly what was once a refuge became a home. Building here was never simple. The land beneath their feet was soft and shifting, more water than soil. To create foundations, families drove wooden piles into the mud, thousands upon thousands of logs, cut from forests far to the north. Oak and alder trunks, stripped of bark, were sunk deep until they reached firmer ground below. Into these wooden forests, platforms of planks were laid, and on top of them rose simple homes of timber and reeds. It could take weeks, even months, to prepare enough foundations for a single building. Yet over time, a patchwork of islands became permanent. Where once there was only marsh, a city began to grow. Life in those early centuries was humble, but not without dignity. The sea provided fish and salt. The narrow strips of higher ground supported gardens of beans, onions, and herbs. Families used small clay pots for cooking, spoons carved from bone or wood, and combs to untangle hair after a day spent working in brine and wind. In the evening, oil lamps flickered against walls of plaster and timber, their flames trembling with each draught from the lagoon. There was hardship, but also resilience. In the mainland cities, Venice looked fragile, a scattering of huts balanced on stilts, vulnerable to storm and tide, and yet the lagoon was a shield as well as a home. Its shallow waters were difficult for heavy ships to navigate. Raiders on horseback could not gallop across mud and reeds. What seemed a weakness was in truth a kind of armor. The Venetians learned to trust the waters, to see the lagoon as both protector and path. Over generations, communities merged and organized. Instead of a king, they turned to assemblies of families and leaders, building a republic where decisions were shared. The Doge, the elected head of state, was chosen not to dominate but to represent. This unusual political balance would remain at the heart of Venice for centuries, shaping it into a city ruled not by sword or crown, but by merchants, councils, and collective will. It is strange to think that so great a republic could begin from so little. Mud, timber, fear, and survival. These were the foundation. And yet, as time passed, strength emerged not from what Venice lacked, but from what it learned to do without: no mines, no fields, no walls of stone, only the ingenuity to turn weakness into resilience. The city grew out of water and necessity, and with every passing decade it stood more firmly against the tides. Now, as you picture this fragile beginning, imagine yourself gliding in a small wooden boat through the silent lagoon. The air is cool on your skin. The water beneath you moves gently, steady and unhurried. Let your own breath fall into that same rhythm, in and out, like the rising and falling tide. With each breath, release the weight of your day and allow yourself to drift with the waters of this ancient city, carried calmly into rest. Morning comes carefully to the lagoon. The light does not break. It seeps in, pearl grey and patient, sliding over water and brick. Bells carry across the air, soft, uneven, the human sound in a watery world. In the square that will one day be called San Marco, people gather with the ordinary tools of living: baskets for bread, a coil of rope over one shoulder, the shawl pulled close against the chill. Faith in Venice does not arrive as thunder. It arrives like the tide, regular, intimate, and necessary. The city that began from fear soon found a different anchor. To be more than a refuge, Venice needed a story to bind it, something older than sandbars and stronger than timber piles sunk into mud. That story took shape as a saint, and with him a symbol that would fly from Venice and sail for 1,000 years. Tradition tells of two Venetian merchants in the year 828, setting out for Alexandria, a place of perfumes and learned books, of spice markets and careful officials. They were not hunting for pepper or silk, though such goods travelled easily through their hands. They sought the relics of St. Mark, the evangelist, a saint long associated with the wider Mediterranean, a figure whose presence could lend weight and blessing to a rising city. In the tale, when the time came to spirit the relics away, the merchants hid them beneath cuts of pork, an audacious disguise to discourage inspection by local authorities. Whether you smile at the audacity or simply admire the cunning, the effect is the same. The bones of a saint cross the sea, and with them a new identity for the city at the water's edge. Objects make stories real. Imagine a casket of wood banded with gilded metal, perhaps lined with silk. Picture the hands that carried it, calloused from rigging lines and oars. Back in the lagoon, crowds gathered, incense rose in coiling threads, wax dripped from candles onto simple iron stands. The scent of sea salt mixed with myrtle and smoke. The small chapel was raised to hold the relics, first modest, then grander with time. The shrine that began as a guarded treasure house would across centuries become the Basilica of San Marco. Its walls a garden of colored marble, its vaults a sky of golden mosaics, where saints and ships and stars share the same radiant light. Under those domes, the winged lion of St. Mark appears, calm, watchful, pads poised on an open book. In a mercantile city where contracts mattered and oaths sealed fortunes, the lion's book carried a quiet promise: order, law, continuity. You might see the lion painted on a ship's square sail, stitched into a banner that snaps in the sea breeze, or hammered into a coin that passes from hand to hand in the market. If modern cities wear their emblems on football jerseys and municipal flags, Venice wore hers on water and wind, announcing itself to every harbour from the Adriatic to the Levant. Faith did not sit only in chapels, it walked the streets in procession. On feast days, a ripple of colour moved through the square, velvet and wool, linen and the first careful hints of silk, brought from distant looms. The Doge and the Great Council processed beneath awnings, the clergy shaded by canopies, the people following in a tide of footsteps. Brass lamps swung gently, their chains chimed, the air thickened with the resin-sweet smell of frankincense. Even the simplest objects became graceful by repetition. The taper of a boy held, its flame trembling. The bell's rope worn smooth by many hands. The small leather pouch of a craftsman, heavy with coins, burned in the arsenal's shadow. By the 11th and 12th centuries, ritual met sea in a ceremony that encapsulated everything Venice believed about itself. Each year on the Feast of the Ascension, the Doge set out in a state barge, gilded and cabined, the Bucentoro, to where the lagoon opens toward the Adriatic. There, in a gesture both theatrical and sincere, he cast a ring into the water. "We wed thee, O sea," the words would say, in a sign of our true and perpetual dominion. City married the element that had cradled it, shielded it, carried it to fortune. If today we cut a ribbon to open a bridge or break a bottle across a ship's bow, the Venetians sealed their covenant with the sea by giving it the symbol of fidelity. There's comfort in regularity. What did such grandeur mean to ordinary lives? Consider the candle maker whose patient hands dipped wicks again and again into warm tallow, building light by slow accretion. Consider the weaver at a narrow loom, throwing the shuttle with even rhythm to make a length of cloth that would drape an altar, or a merchant's shoulders on a feast day. Consider the mason who sets sheets of thin glass into a church window. Murano's furnaces would later make this a Venetian art, and the gilder who pressed leaf gold so delicate it trembled at his breath. Their labor added brightness to a city that turned religion into ceremony, and ceremony into civic glue. There's comfort in regularity, the dark spark in a side canal as the procession passes, the old soft thud in its forcola notch, the familiar chime of the campanile, marking hours in a place where tides already measure time. When the city called itself serene, or La Serenissima, was not claiming calm seas or easy fortunes. It was naming the stillness they sought to hold at the center, the clarity that might support 1,000 bargains, 1,000 journeys, 1,000 careful returns. Not every story glows with gold leaf. There were debates as sharp as the edge of a knife, which relics to venerate, which rites to adopt, how to balance the wishes of popes and emperors with the stubborn independence of a merchant republic. Venice navigated between powers as it navigated channels, feeling for depth with the pole, listening to the current, choosing the line that kept the keel free of sand. The winged line looked outward as often as inward, because the city's faith, like its fortune, depended on motion. In your mind, let those processions thin and fade. The crowd drifts back to work. The last bells blur into the wind. You can still smell the incense in your air, the trace of smoke and spice, as if the market and the chapel share the same breath. Somewhere a child fingers the fringe on a banner and wonders how a lion can have wings, and why a book can calm a city. An elder might say that order is a kind of flight, and words are a kind of harbor. In Venice, such thoughts are part of daily bread. Now imagine a quiet corner of the square as evening returns. A lamp is lit, the flame steadies. The light falls on stone polished by footsteps and time. Let your breathing match that small unwavering flame, soft, even, unhurried. With each exhale, feel the weight slip from your shoulders like a cloak set gently aside. The tide is turning, the city is serene, and you are drifting calmly into rest. The heart of Venice was not only its squares or churches, but a place where wood, rope and iron came together, the arsenal. Entering the arsenal in its prime was like stepping into the lungs of a great living creature. Breath and labor, noise and silence, all serving one purpose, to master the sea. Here ships were not made as singular masterpieces. They were made as if on a line, one after another, a vision centuries ahead of its time. The Venetians had discovered that speed was as vital as skill. A galley could be built in weeks where elsewhere it might take months. Workers specialized, some shaping oars, some sewing sails, others hammering rivets into iron bands. In one hall, cauldron of pitch simmered, the dark resin sealing timbers against the sea. In another, rope makers walked backward, arm over arm, as fibers twisted into long cords that would bind sails and secure anchors. Everyday objects told the story of this maritime empire. Wooden mallets worn smooth by countless strikes, chisels that sang against oak planks, iron nails kept in leather satchels, spilling like dark seeds. At the edge of the yards, barrels of salted fish fed workers during long shifts, and simple clay cups held the wine that quenched their thirst. Even the benches on which they sat at midday seemed to hum with the knowledge that they were shaping more than ships. They were shaping the future of their city. To stand in the arsenal was to sense the order of Venice itself. The Doge and the Great Council ruled in marble halls, but here discipline was measured in hammer blows and oar strokes. A foreign visitor once claimed he saw a galley completed in a single day. So efficient was the labor, so finely tuned the system. Whether this was legend or truth hardly matters. What matters is the impression, a city that could summon a fleet almost as swiftly as another might raise a wall. The galleys themselves were lean and purposeful, long hulls of oak, reinforced with pine and larch, carried banks of rovers. Their oars cut the water with steady rhythm, a heartbeat at sea. When the wind was kind, triangular lateen sails unfold, catching light like wings. Inside, the air was scented with tar, salt and human effort. A simple bench, a bronze lamp swinging in its bracket, a storage chest filled with dried beans and barley. These were the details of life aboard, a floating extension of Venice's stone and timber. The arsenal was more than a factory. It was a symbol of unity. Merchants, nobles and laborers, all dependent on its strength. The spice trade, the defense of sea lanes, the city's pride, all was safeguarded by ships launched from these waters. Venice was a republic of merchants, but without its navy, it would have been no more than a market on stilts. With it, the city became an empire. If we think of modern assembly lines, of humming factories and precise divisions of labor, we glimpse the arsenal's legacy. But here, centuries earlier, men carried timber on their shoulders, rolled barrels across planks, and sang work songs to keep time as they heaved oars and sails into place. These were not just labor, it was rhythm, the rhythm of survival. Close your eyes and imagine the sound, the clang of iron, the scrape of saws. Then a sudden silence as the ship slides down greased timbers into the lagoon, water parting, voices rising in cheer. A new galley born to carry Venice's line across distant seas. Now let the noise soften, fade into a steady pulse, like waves brushing against a wooden hull. Let your breathing follow that rhythm, slow, measured calm. As the workers rest their tools and as the ship rocks gently on its first tide, you too can let yourself drift, carried by the same waters that bore the dreams of Venice. The lagoon may have been a sanctuary, but Venice's gaze always stretched beyond its horizon. Across the Adriatic, across the narrow seas, riches and dangers waited. The city learned early that to survive it must not only trade but also entangle itself in the great currents of history, and few currents were more powerful or more dangerous than the Crusades. By the year 1202, the Fourth Crusade was gathering. Knights from across Europe had sworn to take up the cross, to march east and reclaim the Holy Land. They needed ships, and no city could provide them more swiftly than Venice. The Doge at this time was Enrico Dandolo, old, blind, yet sharp in mind, and relentless in his will. His age was a mantle of authority, his blindness a strange kind of vision that seemed to see what others could not. Venice promised a fleet, but when the Crusaders struggled to pay their debt, Dandolo offered an alternative, service in kind. If they could not offer gold, they could offer steel and obedience. And so instead of sailing straight to Jerusalem, the Crusaders first sailed for Zara, a Christian city but also a rival. It fell, battered by an army meant for holy war. Some knights hesitated, others prayed, but the Venetians pressed on. The Republic was no stranger to practical compromises. Then came the greater gamble, Constantinople, the queen of cities. Jewel of the Byzantine Empire beckoned. For centuries Venice had served Byzantium as an ally, shipbuilder and trader. But relationships shift like tides. With promise of wealth and power, the Crusaders, and Venice with them, turned their prows toward Bosporus. Picture the scene, 1,000 sails catching the sun, waters crowded with ships, oars rising and falling in perfect rhythm. The skyline of Constantinople glittered ahead, domes like polished shields, walls higher and stronger than any in Europe. And yet, in 1204 the unthinkable happened. The city fell, fires rose, treasures spilled into foreign hands, and Venice carried away relics, gold and glory. Horses of bronze were lifted from a Byzantine hippodrome and set later upon St. Mark's Basilica, where they still stand today, watching centuries pass beneath them. This conquest was no simple victory. It was scandal and triumph woven together. Christendom's greatest city plundered by fellow Christians. Yet Venice emerged richer, stronger, holding key ports and islands that formed the Stato de Mar, the empire across the sea. With harbours in Crete and far beyond, Venice became not just a city but a maritime empire, stretching like a net across the Mediterranean. Daily life changed with the empire. In warehouses by the lagoon, merchants handled goods now flowing in endless variety. Silks folded like water, spices glowing in earthen jars, Byzantine icons framed in gilded wood. Dock workers heaved bales of cotton, while scribes bent over ledgers, tallying columns of numbers that whispered the rise of fortunes. An ordinary Venetian might taste pepper more often, see fabrics dyed deeper hues, or hear Greek and Arabic mingling with Italian in the market. And yet, for all its might, the city still moved by ordinary hands, sailors patching sails with bow needles, cooks stirring pots or lentils aboard galleys. Empires rise on such humble details, unnoticed, yet essential. It is tempting to see Venice's capture of Constantinople as a blaze of ambition, but it was also a reflection of its nature, practical, bold, unafraid to blur lines between profit and piety. The doge's blindness may have hidden the flames from his eyes, but he surely felt them in the warmth of victory and the weight of treasures carried home. Now, as you hold the story in your mind, let the images soften. The walls of Constantinople dissolve into mist. The sails fold like closed wings. What remains is the steady rocking of water, the eternal rhythm of oars. Let your breathing follow that rhythm, calm, even, steady. The world may roar with crusades and conquests, but here, on these quiet tides, you are safe and you are at rest. By the 13th century, Venice was no longer just a city of canals and salt marshes. It had become a crossroad of worlds, a place where ships carried the wealth of East and West. To walk through the Venetian markets in those years was to enter a living atlas. Imagine a warehouse along the Grand Canal. The doors stand open and the smell of pepper rushes out first, sharp, tickling the nose. Behind it comes the sweetness of cinnamon, the cool hint of cloves, and the faint bite of ginger. Sacks of nutmeg from distant Banda Islands sit beside bales of cotton and silk from Persia and China. The air is thick with dust from journeys thousands of miles long. One of Venice's greatest sons was Marco Polo, born in 1254 into a family of merchants. He travelled farther than almost any Venetian before him. Alongside his father Nicola and his uncle Maffeo, Marco journeyed east along the Silk Road, eventually reaching the court of the great Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan in China. He spent years in the Khan's service, learning languages, observing customs, and carrying messages across the vast empire. When Marco returned to Venice after more than 2 decades abroad, his stories sounded like wonders. He spoke of paper money, unheard of in Europe at the time, and of black stones that burned hotter than wood. These black stones were coal, a fuel that would one day power the Industrial Revolution. He described porcelain so fine it seemed like seashell. bridges that spanned rivers wider than the Rialto, and cities larger than in any in Europe. Captured during a war with rival Genoa, Marco dictated his adventures in prison to a fellow inmate. The resulting book spread across Europe. To some it was fantasy, to others revelation. In time it would inspire explorers like Christopher Columbus, who carried a copy with him on his own journeys. But Venice did not depend on one man's tales for its fortune. Long before Marco's return, the city had secured dominance over the spice trade. Spices were not luxuries alone, they were necessities. In a world without refrigeration, pepper preserved meat, nutmeg masked the taste of age, cinnamon flavored bread and wine. A handful of cloves would fetch the wages of a laborer for days. For ordinary Venetians, these goods might only be smelled in the air of the markets, or glimpsed in small packets purchased by the wealthy, but their trade made the city rich. The wealth of Venice was visible in everyday life. Candlesticks of bronze stood in workshops where scribes copied contracts and accounts. Parchment crackled under the pressure of quills as merchants tallied goods and debts. Glassmakers on the island of Murano experimented with formulas that produced crystal clear glass, so prized that Venetian mirrors and beads became exports as valuable as silk. Women wore gowns dyed with beautiful reds or indigo blues, while men might fasten a belt with buckles of worked silver brought by Armenian traders. And yet, even in this whirl of commerce, the city's rhythm remained orderly. A gondolier carried passengers with steady strokes of his oar. A cook in a modest home stirred polenta over a fire. What made Venice remarkable was not only what it sold, but how it sold it. The Republic regulated trade through careful laws. Merchants could not sell directly to foreign buyers until goods had first passed through Venetian customs. In this way, the city ensured that every spice, every silk, every gem added a coin or two to the treasury. Modern customs offices at airports work in much the same way, a reminder that Venice pioneered systems still in use today. There's irony here. Venice had no farmland to grow wheat, no mines to dig for silver, no forests to cut for its own wood. It had almost nothing of its own, yet it controlled the wealth of half the world. Not by producing, but by moving, by connecting, by mastering the art of trade. And while rivals like Genoa, Pisa and Florence fought for influence, Venice's ships kept arriving, unloading wares that dazzled and sustained Europe. The Republic became a marketplace of the imagination as much as of goods, a place where East met West, where stories of emperors and deserts mingled with a taste of pepper on a simple stew. Now, as you picture those markets, let the noise soften. The cries of merchants fade into the background. The scent of cinnamon dissolves into the air. What remains is a sense of abundance and calm. Breathe gently as if you too are walking slowly through the arcades, past stalls of cloth and spice, content with the richness of the world around you. With each exhale, let go of hurry, let go of burden, and allow yourself to drift further into rest, carried on the quiet tide of Venice's fortune. The sea has given Venice its fortune, but the sea also bred rivals. No enemy loomed larger than Genoa. If Venice was the mistress of the Adriatic, Genoa held sway over the Ligurian coast. Their merchants quarrelled in ports. Their galleys jostled in Sicilian water, and soon rivalry hardened into war. The struggle peaked in the War of Chioggia, 1378 to 1381, conflict that nearly strangled Venice at its roots. Genoa's fleets were sleek and formidable. They slipped into the lagoon and captured the fishing town Chioggia, just south of Venice. Suddenly the Republic found enemy banners planted at its doorsteps. Panic spread through the canals. If Chioggia can fall, can Venice also fall? The people rallied. Citizens melted down silver candlesticks to fund the fleet. Noblemen unaccustomed to hardship took up command at sea. Fishermen abandoned nets for oars, rowing in the great galleys. In the arsenal, the colossal shipyard, hammers rang without rest. Sparks flew as carpenters bent timbers, and women stitched sails under torchlight. Even children carried nails, buckets of pitch. City lived as one body, straining for survival. Venice turned to its commander, Peter Pisani, once disgraced but now restored. Imprisoned after earlier defeats, he returned with the humility of failure and the fire of determination. With him stood the Doge Andrea Contarini, who at over 80 years old donned armor and led men by example. Their leadership became a legend. Slowly, they hemmed in the Genoa people inside Chioggia. Supplies dwindled, morale cracked, and the proud enemy surrendered. The victory saved Venice, but at a heavy cost. Ships lay broken, coffers strained, and scars marked the city. Yet from disaster came resilience. Genoa never again threatened Venice so deeply, and the Republic emerged convinced that its survival depended on constant vigilance. But the sea, however rich, could no longer be the only pillar of power. The population of Venice grew, and with it came hunger. The Republic owned no farmland of its own. Plague and famine haunted memories. So Venice turned inland, claiming territories across the terra firma. These fertile plains became the breadbasket, yet Venice did not farm with Venetian hands. Instead, it relied on the mercenary captains whose loyalty lasted only as long as their pay. Some were brilliant, like Bartolomeo Colleoni, whose statue still rides bronze in Venice today. Others betrayed employers for a higher wage. Gold became the Republic's sword, contracts its shield. It was a dangerous bargain, for mercenaries could vanish like mist. Meanwhile, Venice's soul remained tied to order. It was in these years that the gondola emerged as the city's defining vessel. Sleek, narrow, perfectly suited to the maze of canals, it became more than transport. It became a symbol. By law, gondolas were painted black, their elegance restrained, their curves graceful as waves. Inside, cushions and lanterns softened the ride. For daily life, the gondola was essential. The merchant carried ledgers across the Grand Canal. The bride crossed to her new home. Priests were rowed to Mass, and the children giggled as they dangled hands in the water. Daily rhythms continued even in times of war. Bakers pulled loaves from smoky ovens. Tailors stitched wool cloaks for the winter chill. War was distant thunder. Life was heartbeat of bread, cloth and water. And so Venice survived, by sea, by land, by compromise. The Republic was not invincible, but it was adaptable, and that resilience kept it alive when kingdoms rose and fall. Now let the battles fade from your mind. The clatter of swords softens, the shouts dissolve into silence. Picture instead a gondola gliding on dark water, its lantern casting a gentle glow. The oar dips again, a steady rhythm. Feel yourself rocked by that rhythm. Calm, safe, unhurried as the lagoon cradles you into rest. By the 16th century, Venice still shone, but its brilliance was that of a sunset. Golden, dazzling, yet slowly fading. In 1571, the Republic fought its last great naval triumph, the Battle of Lepanto. Here Venice joined Spain and other allies in a vast coalition against the Ottoman Turks. The fleets stretched for miles, hundreds of galleys, banners snapping in the wind, cannon mouths glinting in sunlight. When the battle came, it was thunder and chaos. Cannon fire ripping wood, muskets cracking, men shouting prayers. Venice's ships played a central role, and when the victory came, it was hailed across Christendom. Yet even in this triumph carried shadows. Venice had proved it could still fight, but the world was shifting. The trade routes now circled Africa and crossed the Atlantic. Portuguese caravels brought spices directly from India. Spanish galleons ferried silver from the New World. The Mediterranean, once the heart of trade, was becoming a quiet backwater. Venice, bound to the sea, was left watching wealth slip past. At home, the Republic turned inward. The Venetian Inquisition, wary of hearsay, kept a watchful eye. Printing presses were censored, books scrutinized, foreign ideas filtered. Yet art thrived even under constant constraint. Titian painted with fire and shadow. Tintoretto filled vast canvases with drama. Veronese splashed feasts with color. In churches, choirs sang, and the music of Gabriele echoed through domes like voices from heaven. Life in Venice was still rich. Along the Grand Canal, palaces gleamed, their marble facades mirrored in water. Carnival brought masks and mystery, nobles disguised as peasants, peasants as kings, all equal for a night. Gondolas carried revelers to feasts where tables groaned with roasted meats, candied fruits and wine glowing in glass goblets from Murano. Laughter spilled into alleys, while beyond quiet households simmered pots of polenta and lentils, modest yet sustaining. This was the long gilded sunset, the city luminous even as its power waned. The arsenal, once alive with constant shipbuilding, felt quieter. Merchants still tallied accounts, but the columns no longer soared. Wealth persisted, but decline whispered at the edges. Then, in 1797, the end came swiftly. Napoleon Bonaparte, young and brilliant, swept into Italy. His armies, drilled and determined, reached Venice. The Republic, weary and unprepared, could not resist. With barely a fight, the government surrendered. 1,000 years of independence ended with a pen stroke. The Lion of St. Mark, symbol of Venetian pride, was lowered. And yet though the Republic died, the city endured. The canals still gleamed, the gondolas still glided, and the stone of St. Mark's Basilica still shimmered with gold. Venice has lost power but not beauty. Now imagine golden light spreading across the lagoon. The sun lowers, gliding the water, warming the air. Slowly it sinks and twilight comes. With each breath, feel that golden calm. Exhale and let the weight of history fade as you drift into the serenity of sunset.